The clock strikes 7 on a cold November evening in Munich. A single gunshot echoes through the beer hall. Adolf Hitler collapses. The date is November 8th, 1939, exactly 16 years after his failed putsch at this very location. But this time, there is no recovery, no prison memoir, no second act. The Führer is dead, and with him, the entire trajectory of the 20th century stands poised to veer into uncharted territory. This scenario is not pure fantasy. Throughout Hitler's reign, over 40 documented assassination attempts were planned or executed. In our timeline, Carpenter Georg Elser came breathtakingly close on November 8th, 1939, planting a time bomb in the Bürgerbräukeller that exploded just 13 minutes after Hitler had unexpectedly left early. Had the Führer lingered for his usual duration, history would have turned on those 13 minutes. So let us step through the looking glass and examine what would have unfolded if Elser's bomb had found its mark, killing Hitler in November 1939, just 2 months after Germany invaded Poland but before the conquest of France. The immediate aftermath would have plunged Nazi Germany into a succession crisis of staggering proportions. The Nazi state was not a well-oiled bureaucratic machine, but rather a feudal system of overlapping authorities held together entirely by Hitler's charisma and his skill at playing subordinates against each other. Heinrich Himmler commanded the SS and its growing empire of terror. Hermann Göring led the Luftwaffe and held the title of Hitler's designated successor. Joseph Goebbels controlled the propaganda apparatus. Rudolf Hess served as deputy Führer. Each of these men commanded fanatical loyalty from their own followers, but none possessed Hitler's unifying authority over the Nazi movement as a whole. The power struggle would have erupted within hours. Göring would have immediately claimed leadership based on his official designation, but the ambitious Himmler controlled the instruments of state security and violence through the SS and Gestapo. Goebbels wielded the power to shape public perception, while the Wehrmacht generals, never fully comfortable with Nazi rule, might have seen an opportunity to reassert military control over a regime that had subordinated them to party loyalists. Historical evidence suggests that senior military commanders like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl privately despised the party hierarchy, and without Hitler's intimidating presence, the fractures between party and military would have widened into chasms. The most probable outcome would have been a collective leadership, an unstable triumvirate or junta attempting to maintain control while various factions jockeyed for supremacy. But here is where the timing becomes absolutely critical. In November 1939, Germany had already invaded Poland, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France. But the Western Front remained quiet during the so-called phony war. German forces had not yet launched their devastating blitzkrieg through the Low Countries and France. The complete military plans for Case Yellow, the invasion of France, existed primarily in Hitler's strategic vision and the detailed work of General Erich von Manstein, whose unorthodox plan to strike through the Ardennes had only recently gained Hitler's approval over the objections of more conservative generals. Without Hitler's driving force and his willingness to embrace high-risk strategies, the German invasion of France would likely have been postponed indefinitely or executed in a far more conventional and cautious manner. The original plans proposed by the German High Command called for a predictable assault through Belgium, essentially a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I. This approach would have allowed the Allies time to establish strong defensive positions and would have almost certainly resulted in a grinding stalemate rather than a shocking 6-week conquest that occurred in our timeline. Military historians agree that Hitler's personal intervention in strategic planning, particularly his backing of Manstein's audacious Ardennes plan, was instrumental in Germany's stunning victory over France. A German leadership without Hitler might have pursued a negotiated settlement with the Western powers. Several key figures, including Göring himself, had expressed interest in reaching accommodation with Britain before the war. Senior Wehrmacht officers like General Ludwig Beck, who had resigned in protest over Hitler's aggressive policies, might have found renewed influence. The British government under Neville Chamberlain had spent years attempting to avoid war through appeasement and elements within the British establishment, including some in the aristocracy and business community, harbored hopes that Germany might serve as a bulwark against Soviet communism rather than an existential enemy. Poland would have remained a tragic casualty, already conquered and partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But a negotiated peace might have preserved Western Europe from occupation, saved millions of lives, and prevented the Holocaust from expanding beyond Poland into an industrialized genocide, consuming all of Europe. This last point cannot be overstated. While virulent anti-Semitism permeated the Nazi movement, the systematic industrial extermination of European Jewry was personally driven by Hitler's ideological obsession. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, which opened the Eastern territories where the majority of Holocaust victims perished, was Hitler's crusade, opposed by many in the Wehrmacht who feared a two-front war. However, we must avoid the comfortable illusion that Hitler's death would have automatically produced a peaceful, liberal outcome. The Nazi regime would have survived his assassination, albeit in a different form. The apparatus of dictatorship, the concentration camps, the racial laws, the suppression of dissent, all of this was already firmly established. Himmler's SS would have continued operating the camps. Anti-Semitic persecution would have continued, though probably without escalating to genocide on the scale we witnessed. The new leadership would have faced the same fundamental question that plagued Hitler: how to sustain a militaristic economy prepared for total war without actually achieving the territorial expansion and resource extraction that military conquests provide. The alternative scenario also depends heavily on Stalin's calculations. The Soviet dictator had entered his pact with Hitler, believing it bought him time to prepare for an inevitable conflict. With Germany weakened by internal power struggles and possibly bogged down in a stalemated war with the West, Stalin might have moved more aggressively to expand Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, potentially invading Finland, the Baltic states, and even portions of Romania earlier than occurred historically. This could have pushed the Western powers toward viewing the Soviet Union rather than Germany as the primary threat, potentially even forcing a strange alignment between a post-Hitler Germany and the Western democracies against Soviet expansion. The most profound impact would have resonated through the decades that followed. Without the crucible of World War II as we know it, the United States might never have emerged as a global superpower with military bases spanning the planet. The United Nations might never have been created. The impetus for European integration that led to the European Union emerged directly from the determination to prevent another European catastrophe. Decolonization, accelerated by the war's devastation of European empires, might have proceeded far more slowly. The Holocaust horror gave urgency to the creation of Israel and fundamentally reshaped global consciousness about human rights and genocide. The butterfly effects spiral outward infinitely. Technologies developed for the war effort, from radar to rockets to nuclear weapons, would have followed different timelines. Cultural movements, demographic shifts, economic systems, all transformed by World War II, would have evolved along unrecognizable paths. Even our moral categories, our understanding of absolute evil and totalitarian systems, were forged in the fire of that conflict. The question ultimately forces us to confront history's contingency. 13 minutes separated our world from this alternate timeline. A single carpenter's precise calculation, Hitler's uncharacteristic decision to leave early, the ticking of a timer hidden in a pillar. Small moments, tremendous consequences. The past is not an inevitability marching toward predetermined ends, but rather a precarious balance of human choices, accidents, and timing. Understanding this does not diminish history's lessons, but rather sharpens them, reminding us that the future, like the past, remains unwritten until the moment decisions crystallize into action.